The early morning sun filtered through the apartment windows as Emma stood frozen in her small kitchen, her coffee mug suspended midway to her lips. It was 7:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, and in exactly 13 minutes, her entire life would either be restored or shattered into 1,000 irretrievable pieces. She set the mug down carefully on the counter, afraid that if she didn't, her trembling hands might drop it. In the adjoining bedroom, she could hear Lily singing softly to herself, a nursery rhyme she'd learned at. The sweet, innocent melody pierced Emma's chest like a blade. How many more mornings would she wake up to that beautiful sound? The question had tormented her for months, keeping her awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling of her tiny bedroom, counting her failures like prayer beads. Emma walked to Lily's bedroom door and leaned against the frame, watching her daughter sit cross-legged on her bed, carefully arranging a collection of stuffed animals in a perfect line. Lily was only 3 years old, barely old enough to understand that her world was crumbling, yet somehow she seemed to sense the tension that had saturated their home. The girl's small face was serious as she positioned each toy, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration. She wore the pink dress Emma had washed and pressed the night before, the one with the embroidered butterflies that Lily loved. Emma had chosen it deliberately, knowing that judges notice such details. Everything mattered now. Everything. "Good morning, baby," Emma whispered, her voice catching slightly. Lily's head snapped up and her face transformed into a brilliant smile. "Mommy, I made friends with all my toys. They're going to court with us today." Emma's eyes burned with unshed tears. She forced a smile, knelt down, and pulled her daughter into a fierce embrace. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. They'll keep us company." But the truth was far more complicated than Lily could possibly understand. This wasn't a field trip or an adventure. Today, a judge would decide whether Emma was fit to be her mother, whether the woman who had sacrificed everything for this child was worthy of keeping her. The custody battle had begun 8 months ago, shortly after Emma had filed for divorce from. Their marriage had been deteriorating for years, a slow erosion of trust and communication that had left them as strangers sharing a bed. But the final straw had come when Emma discovered that business trips were actually extended disappearances where he would ignore calls for days, returning home smelling of alcohol and strange women's perfume. When she'd confronted him, he'd laughed, actually laughed, and told her that she should have expected this when she married him. Emma had demanded a divorce and, more importantly, primary custody of Lily. That's when had decided to fight back. Not because he suddenly wanted to be a devoted father. He'd barely been present during Lily's infancy. But because he saw it as a challenge to his pride. He hired an expensive attorney, the kind who specialized in custody battles, and began constructing a narrative designed to paint Emma as an unfit mother. The first hearing had been devastating. His attorney argued that Emma's job as a registered nurse required her to work 12-hour shifts, often with irregular scheduling. He suggested that Lily was being neglected, shuffled between workers who didn't truly care about her. He presented character witnesses, friends of who about Emma's obsession with her career at the expense of motherhood. It was all carefully crafted lies, but the judge had listened with an expression of grave concern. Emma had fought back, providing documentation of her perfect attendance at every school function, medical appointment, and parent-teacher conference. She showed receipts for Lily's new shoes, her art supplies, her books. She brought teachers from the Who that Lily was well-adjusted, happy, and clearly deeply loved. She'd even gotten letters from families she'd cared for during her nursing career, vouching for her compassion and dedication. But none of it seemed to be enough. The judge had ordered a full custody evaluation, which meant months of interviews, home visits, and psychological assessments. Emma had submitted to every requirement, opening her home, her finances, and her heart to complete strangers. She'd been evaluated by a court-appointed psychologist who spent 3 hours in her apartment, examining everything from her refrigerator contents to her parenting decisions. The psychologist had been kind enough, but Emma could never quite tell what conclusions were being drawn. Throughout it all, Lily remained the center of Emma's universe. Every decision, every moment, every choice was made with her daughter's best interests in mind. Emma had turned down overtime opportunities, passed on promotions, and sacrificed her own social life to ensure she was present for Lily. She decorated their small apartment with hand-painted murals and created reading nooks filled with books. She'd learned to braid Lily's hair into intricate styles and could recite every episode of Lily's favorite children's show. But none of it had felt like enough. Not when facing the legal machinery designed to second-guess every maternal instinct, to find fault in every decision, to suggest that a working mother was inherently selfish. Now, as Emma helped Lily into her pink dress and buckled her tiny shoes, her mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if the judge ruled in his favor? What if she lost custody and was relegated to weekend visits? The thought made her physically ill. She'd read stories online, countless, heartbreaking stories of mothers who'd lost their children in custody disputes. Women who were every bit as devoted as she was, women who'd done everything right, and yet still found themselves separated from their bobbies. The drive to the courthouse was silent except for Lily's soft singing. Emma's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She took the exit to downtown, navigating the familiar streets that had become as routine to her as her own heartbeat over the past 8 months. Every turn toward the courthouse felt like walking toward Judgment Day itself. She found a parking spot and sat for a moment, gathering her courage. In the back seat, Lily had stopped singing and was now clutching her worn teddy bear, the one she'd had since infancy, its fur matted and faded from countless embraces. Emma turned around and looked at her daughter, this small miracle who had changed everything, who had given her life purpose and meaning. "Remember what I told you, baby," Emma said softly. Lily nodded solemnly. "I'm just going to tell the truth." "That's right. You just tell the truth and everything will be okay." But even as she said the words, Emma wasn't sure she believed them. She'd learned that truth wasn't always enough in courtrooms. Lawyers could twist words, judges could misinterpret intentions, and systems could fail the people who needed them most. Still, she took Lily's small hand in hers, squeezed it gently, and opened the car door. The courthouse steps loomed before them, vast and imposing. Emma felt small, insignificant, as if she were climbing toward her own execution. Somewhere inside that building, Judge was waiting. Somewhere inside and his expensive attorney were preparing their arguments. And somewhere inside, a decision was about to be made that would define the rest of their lives. Emma took a deep breath, looked down at her daughter, and together they climbed toward their uncertain future. The courthouse hallway smelled like polished marble and desperation. Emma sat rigidly on a wooden bench outside the courtroom, her arm wrapped protectively around Lily, who swung her legs back and forth, not quite touching the floor. The waiting area was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy and suffocating. Other people sat scattered throughout. A woman with red-rimmed eyes, an older man in a wrinkled suit, a young couple who looked like they were about to shatter into pieces. Everyone here was going through their own private hell, their own battles that seemed monumental to them, even if the world didn't care. Emma's attorney, Winters, sat beside her, reviewing documents one last time, was a thin woman in her 50s with sharp features and sharper intellect. She'd been kind but brutally honest throughout this process. "The judge leans conservative on custody matters," she told Emma during their last meeting. "She believes children need stability and routine. Your job helps that argument, but's team will exploit the irregular hours." Emma had nodded, absorbing the information like a sponge absorbing poison. "How are you holding up?" whispered, her eyes not leaving her legal pad. "I'm terrified," Emma admitted, keeping her voice low so Lily wouldn't hear. Finally looked at her. "That's normal, but remember we have a strong case. The reports are glowing. Your home visit evaluation was excellent. You've documented everything. Stay calm in there, answer questions directly, and don't volunteer information. Let me do the talking." Emma nodded, but her stomach churned with anxiety. She'd gone through this twice before, 2 previous hearings where she'd answered questions and tried to prove her worth as a mother. Each time, she'd left the courtroom feeling like she'd somehow failed, despite everyone telling her she'd done well. How could she possibly prove something so fundamental, so inherent to her very being? Across the hallway, she could see sitting with his attorney, David, was dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, his dark hair perfectly styled. To anyone looking at him for the first time, he appeared to be a successful businessman, confident, prosperous, trustworthy. Only Emma knew the truth behind the facade. She knew about the nights he'd come home reeking of cigarettes and cheap vodka. She knew about the mysterious phone calls he'd take behind closed doors. She knew about the times he'd promised to pick up Lily and then simply didn't show up, leaving Emma scrambling to arrange. But how could she make a judge understand that? How could words possibly capture the disappointment in a toddler's eyes when her father forgot about her again? Caught her eye and smirked, actually smirked. His expression said everything. He was confident, perhaps even amused by the whole process. He'd told her during one of their last conversations, no judge is going to take a child away from her father just because her mother has some emotional issues. The arrogance in his voice had been breathtaking. Emma looked away, focusing on Lily instead. Her daughter was examining her shoes with great interest, occasionally looking up at the decorative ceiling tiles as if they held the secrets of the universe. Lily had no idea what was happening, no understanding that her entire future hung in the balance. Emma, that innocence, even as she desperately wanted to protect it. At exactly 9:47 a.m., the courtroom doors opened and Judge stepped out, her black robe swishing around her as she walked with purpose. She was a tall woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her expression was always neutral, giving nothing away. Emma had spent hours trying to read the judge's face during previous hearings, searching for some indication of her leanings. It was impossible. "We're ready for you," Judge said simply, gesturing toward the courtroom. Emma's heart began to pound, squeezed her arm reassuringly. They stood, and Emma took Lily's hand, leading her toward the heavy wooden doors. The courtroom was exactly as Emma remembered it, the judge's bench elevated high, the witness stand to the right, the 2 attorney tables facing each other like opponents in a chess match. The bailiff stood to the side, and a court reporter sat ready to document every word. Judge settled herself behind the bench and surveyed the room with the expression of someone about to render a verdict on the human condition itself. She opened a thick folder containing 8 months of documentation, testimony transcripts, and evaluation reports. "Before we proceed," the judge said, her voice measured and authoritative, "I want to state for the record that this case has been unusually contentious. Both parents have presented compelling arguments about their capabilities and the other's shortcomings. The evaluation reports are generally positive regarding both parties. The child appears healthy, happy, and well cared for. However, the court must balance the mother's work schedule against the father's greater availability." The judge was interrupted by a commotion at the back of the courtroom. The doors burst open with surprising force. Everyone turned to look. A police officer in a dark uniform stood in the doorway, and beside him, on a sturdy leather leash, was an enormous German shepherd. The dog's coat gleamed under the courtroom lights, and its eyes were alert, intelligent, focused. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. "Your Honor," the officer said, stepping into the courtroom with the K-9 beside him, "I apologize for the interruption. We have urgent business pertaining to this case." Judge's expression shifted from judicial composure to sharp curiosity. She set down her pen deliberately. "Officer, this is highly irregular. We're in the middle of a custody hearing. Whatever this is, it can wait." "I'm afraid it can't, Your Honor," the officer replied, his voice grave and professional. "We have information that directly impacts the custody determination you're about to make." Emma's eyes widened. She had no idea what this was about. She glanced at whose face had gone pale, shook her head slightly, indicating she was equally confused. However, had gone absolutely rigid. His tan complexion had drained to an ashen gray. His attorney leaned over and began whispering urgently, but wasn't responding. His eyes were fixed on the K9, then darted to the officer's face, then back to the dog. It was the expression of a man watching his world collapse in real time. "Can you explain yourself, officer?" Judge demanded, her judicial authority reasserting itself. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm Officer James Mitchell with the Federal Drug Enforcement Agency, K9 Division. We've been conducting an investigation for the past 14 months, and we have evidence that directly relates to the parental fitness of one of the parties in this hearing." The courtroom erupted into whispers. The bailiff stood up, alert, grabbed Emma's arm, her nails digging in slightly. Emma felt dizzy, as if the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Federal investigation, Drug Enforcement Agency. What was happening? Judge banged her gavel once sharply. "Silence. Officer Mitchell, step forward and explain this to me immediately, and get that dog closer to the bench." Officer Mitchell walked down the center aisle, the German Shepherd moving with disciplined precision beside him. The K9's nails clicked against the polished courtroom floor with each step. The sound echoed through the silent room like a countdown to something momentous. "Your Honor," Officer Mitchell began, positioning himself in front of the judge's bench, "we have reason to believe that has been engaged in illegal drug manufacturing and trafficking operations. Our investigation has been thorough, and we were prepared to execute a search warrant on his property later today. However, given that we're in the middle of a custody hearing that will determine if a child remains in his custody, we felt obligated to inform you immediately of the nature of these allegations." Emma's hand flew to her mouth. She looked at who was now visibly trembling. His attorney was frantically writing notes, his face the color of old parchment. "This is outrageous," his attorney shouted, standing up. "These are unproven allegations. This is clearly a—" "Sit down, mister," Judge commanded, her voice like steel. She turned to Officer Mitchell. "What evidence do you have?" Officer Mitchell's K9 moved slightly, his ears perked forward. The dog seemed to sense the tension in the room, the high stakes of this moment. "Substantial evidence, Your Honor. Financial records, surveillance documentation, informant tips, and chemical residue analysis. We're prepared to present a full briefing to the court if necessary." Judge looked from the officer then to Emma, then back to the officer. Her expression was unreadable, but Emma could see the wheels turning behind her eyes, the implications of this information, the way it transformed everything. "This changes the nature of this hearing significantly," Judge said slowly. "Officer Mitchell, you and your K9 partner will remain here. We need to discuss this at length before I make any custody determination." Emma felt's hand squeezed hers. She wasn't sure if this was good news or if the nightmare was simply evolving into something new and incomprehensible. The courtroom felt suffocating. Judge had called for a brief recess to process what had just been presented. During those 15 minutes, the atmosphere had shifted from the sterile formality of a custody hearing to something far more sinister. Officers had arrived, setting up documents and photographic evidence on the prosecution's table. The casual observers who'd been sitting in the gallery, bored relatives waiting for other cases to be called, had been cleared out by bailiffs. This was no longer a standard family law matter. This was a federal criminal investigation. When the judge reconvened the hearing, a prosecutor named Assistant District Attorney Michael Torres stood and approached the bench. He was a tall man in his mid-40s with sharp eyes and the confident bearing of someone who'd successfully prosecuted hundreds of cases. He carried a thick accordion file that seemed to contain the weight of evidence against. "Your Honor," Ada Torres began, his voice resonating through the courtroom with careful precision, "I understand this is highly unusual territory for a custody hearing. However, We felt obligated to bring this information to your attention given the circumstances. Officer Mitchell and his team have been conducting an extensive investigation into for 14 months. What we've uncovered is deeply troubling, particularly given the fact that a minor child has been in his home. Emma felt her stomach clench. She reached over and covered Lily's ears gently, worried about what was coming next, leaned toward her and whispered, "Let's see what they have. This could help us significantly." Ada Torres opened his file and began laying out documentation on the judge's bench. He spoke methodically, building his case piece by piece like a master architect constructing a building from blueprints. Approximately 16 months ago, we received an anonymous tip regarding suspicious chemical purchases by. Initially, these purchases seemed innocuous individually: fertilizers, cleaning supplies, various household items. However, when cross-referenced with his bank records and purchasing patterns, a disturbing picture emerged. Over a 12-month period, made 47 purchases totaling nearly $200,000 at chemical suppliers across 3 states. These weren't the purchases of an ordinary businessman. They were the purchases of someone setting up a drug manufacturing operation. Attorney was objecting strenuously, standing up repeatedly, claiming this was inadmissible, that Ada Torres was presenting hearsay and speculation. But judge silenced him with a look that could cut glass. "I'll allow it," the judge said coldly. "Continue, Mr. Torres." The prosecutor nodded and moved forward. "We initiated surveillance on Mr.'s primary residence, the house located at 2847 Drive. For 3 months, we documented suspicious activity. Late-night deliveries by unmarked vans, individuals arriving at odd hours and departing with packages, heat signatures indicating underground activity using thermal imaging. Most significantly, we detected industrial-grade chemical odors consistent with methamphetamine manufacturing operations." Emma felt her vision swim. Methamphetamine. This wasn't just white-collar crime or financial malfeasance. This was the kind of activity that destroyed communities, that created addiction and suffering. This was the world that Lily had been exposed to. "In addition to the chemical evidence," Ada Torres continued, pulling out photographs, "we have financial records showing that Mr. deposited large sums of cash into accounts under various names. Between $80,000 and $120,000 monthly deposits with no corresponding legitimate income documentation. His official employment records indicate he works as a consultant, but his supposed clients are either shell companies or don't exist. We've traced wire transfers to known distributors in 5 states." The photographs Ada Torres was showing to the judge depicted vehicles, buildings, individuals Emma didn't recognize. Each image represented a thread in the web of criminal activity. The prosecutor was painting a picture of systemic, organized drug trafficking, something far more sophisticated than a simple user cooking methamphetamine in a garage. "The most disturbing aspect of this investigation, Your Honor," Ada Torres said, his voice taking on a grave tone, "involves the child in question. According to our surveillance records and informant interviews, the minor has been present at the residence on multiple occasions. We have video footage documenting her presence." Emma gasped. She'd had no idea. How many times had claimed he was taking Lily somewhere innocent when he was actually taking her to a house containing a drug manufacturing operation. The thought made her physically ill. Attorney was now frantically gesturing at his client, whispering urgently. His face had gone from ashen to an unhealthy shade of gray-green. His hands were shaking visibly. He looked like a man watching his carefully constructed life implode in real time. "Based on this evidence, Your Honor," Ada Torres concluded, "we obtained a federal warrant for Mr.'s property. We intend to conduct a full search today. The K-9 unit you see before you has been trained to detect narcotics and precursor chemicals. Officer Mitchell is prepared to participate in that search and provide testimony regarding his findings." Judge's expression was grim. She removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes, a gesture that revealed her underlying distress with this situation. Mr. Torres, are you telling me that there is a high probability that controlled substances and drug manufacturing equipment will be found on property? Yes, Your Honor. I would estimate near certainty based on our investigation thus far. The judge replaced her glasses and looked directly at Mr. Do you have anything to say in response to these allegations? Attorney immediately stood up. Your Honor, we invoke Mr.'s Fifth Amendment rights. He will not be answering any questions regarding these allegations. Of course you do, Judge said flatly. She turned her attention to Emma. Ms., I presume you were unaware of these activities. Put a hand on Emma's arm, clearly considering objecting, but Emma spoke anyway. Your Honor, I had absolutely no idea. I would have never allowed Lily near. She couldn't finish the sentence. The implications were too horrifying. I believe you, Judge said, and there was something in her tone that suggested genuine sympathy. She looked at Lily, who was sitting quietly, coloring on a piece of paper that the bailiff had provided, completely unaware that her world was being dismantled around her. Officer Mitchell stood and cleared his throat. Your Honor, if I may speak. Judge nodded. Based on our surveillance and investigation, we have strong reason to believe there is active drug manufacturing occurring at the Drive residence. The presence of a young child in an environment with hazardous chemicals presents an immediate danger. Methamphetamine labs often contain toxic substances and explosive chemicals. The risk to the child's health and safety is substantial. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Emma gripped the edge of the bench. His hand found her shoulder. Furthermore, Officer Mitchell continued, we have reason to believe Mr. has been using the child's presence as cover for his activities. It's not uncommon in these situations for individuals to use children as unwitting camouflage for criminal operations. Law enforcement is less likely to conduct surveillance on a house where a young child is present. It's a psychological manipulation. Emma made a small sound, almost a whimper. She'd thought was at least trying, in his own selfish way, to maintain some connection with his daughter. But instead, he'd been using Lily, using her innocence as a shield for his criminal enterprise, using her presence to deflect suspicion. Your Honor, Ada Torres said, approaching the bench once more, given this new information, we strongly recommend that custody of the minor be modified immediately. The child has been exposed to a dangerous criminal environment. Her father is an active participant in drug trafficking and manufacturing. The risk to her physical and emotional is too significant to ignore. Judge leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. She was silent for a long moment, a moment that felt like it stretched into eternity. Finally, she looked at Emma. Ms., based on the information presented today, I am making a preliminary determination regarding custody. You will retain primary physical custody of Lily, effective immediately. Mr.'s visitation privileges are hereby suspended pending the outcome of the criminal investigation and subsequent charges. This is not a final custody determination, but rather an emergency protective measure to ensure the safety and of the minor child. Emma felt the room tilt. She'd won. She'd actually won. But the victory felt hollow, overshadowed by the revelation of what her daughter had been exposed to. We will reconvene for a full custody hearing once the criminal proceedings have been resolved, Judge continued. For now, the priority is protecting this child from further exposure to this situation. She looked at with an expression of barely concealed contempt. Mister, I suggest you speak with your attorney about both the criminal charges you're about to face and the prospects of your parental rights in light of these revelations. The gavel came down with a finality that echoed through Emma's entire being. The silence that followed Judge's decision was deafening. Emma sat frozen, barely comprehending what had just happened. She'd come to this courthouse convinced she was fighting for scraps, maybe weekend visitation, maybe shared custody. But instead, she'd been granted full primary custody in a single ruling. Yet even as relief began to seep into her consciousness, the reality of why remained suffocating. Ada Torres was gathering his documents, already preparing for the next phase, the physical search of his property. Officer Mitchell stood with the German Shepherd, discussing details with another federal agent. The courtroom was beginning to empty, bailiffs beginning to close files and secure the gallery. This hearing was transitioning from family law to criminal proceedings, and the machinery of justice was beginning to mobilize. Emma reached over and pulled Lily closer, breathing in the scent of her daughter's shampoo, needing to ground herself in the reality of her child's presence. Lily, oblivious to the magnitude of what had transpired, was still coloring, occasionally looking up at the adults around her with the casual curiosity of a 3-year-old. "We're leaving soon, baby," Emma whispered, her voice still shaky from the emotional of the past hour. But Lily wasn't paying attention. Her eyes had been caught by something else entirely. Her small body went rigid. Her crayon fell from her fingers and clattered onto the wooden floor. Emma felt Lily tense, her daughter's gaze locked on something with an intensity that seemed inappropriate for her age. The German Shepherd. Officer Mitchell was walking the dog toward the exit, the animal moving with disciplined precision, his muscular frame covered in a dark coat that caught the courtroom lights. The K9 was clearly trained, focused, professional, but to Lily, something about this dog triggered a profound recognition. Lily's mouth opened. Her pointing finger shot up so quickly that Emma barely saw it move. The child's voice, usually soft and somewhat quiet, suddenly rang out through the courtroom with startling clarity. "That one, that one." Emma's head snapped toward her daughter, "Lily." But Lily wasn't finished. She was standing up now, still pointing at the German Shepherd with an intensity that was almost feverish. Every adult in the room had stopped what they were doing. Judge, who had begun reviewing another file, looked up sharply. Ada Torres paused mid-step. Officer Mitchell turned, his hand instinctively tightening on the leash. "That one, Lily repeated, her voice becoming increasingly urgent, as if she desperately needed everyone to understand the significance of what she was seeing. The entire courtroom fell absolutely silent. It was the kind of silence that occurs when something momentous is about to happen, when the universe is about to pivot on an unexpected axis. Gripped Emma's arm so tightly it hurt. Emma's heart began to pound. She could feel every eye in the room turning toward them, toward Lily. What did her daughter know? What memory had been triggered by the sight of this particular dog? "Lily, what do you mean?" Emma whispered, leaning close to her daughter. But she kept her voice low, unsure if this was something they should be discussing in open court, unsure of what Lily was trying to communicate. Lily's eyes were wide, almost frightened. She was bouncing slightly, the way she did when she was anxious or excited or overwhelmed. Her pointing finger remained extended, unwavering, locked directly on the German Shepherd that Officer Mitchell was holding. "Daddy's dog, Daddy's dog." The words seemed to freeze the courtroom. Emma felt the floor beneath her shift. She looked at whose face had gone pale. She looked at Judge, whose expression had transformed from judicial detachment to sharp, predatory attention. Ada Torres slowly turned around, his entire body language changing. He was no longer simply gathering files. He was studying Lily with the intensity of a scientist examining an unexpected specimen. "Officer Mitchell," Judge commanded, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Stop! Bring the dog back here." Officer Mitchell exchanged a confused glance with the Ada, but he obeyed, walking the German Shepherd back toward where Lily stood. The dog seemed well trained enough to remain calm, though his ears perked forward with interest at being repositioned. "Young lady," Judge said, leaning forward and addressing Lily directly, her judicial demeanor softening slightly. "What do you know about that dog?" Lily's eyes darted between the Judge and the German Shepherd. She suddenly seemed less certain, as if she'd said something without fully understanding it, and now she wasn't sure how to explain herself. "I know that dog," Lily said simply, in the way that only a small child could state something so profoundly important as if it were obvious to everyone. Emma's mind was racing. What dog? When would Lily have seen a dog at its house? They'd never had a pet, had always said he was allergic. Emma had assumed the few times Lily had stayed overnight at his apartment that his place was dog-free. But apparently something had changed. Apparently had acquired a dog that looked like this K9. "Sweetheart," said gently, leaning forward, "where did you see that dog?" Lily looked at her mother, then back at the dog, then at the adults surrounding her as if deciding whether it was safe to tell this story. "At Daddy's house," she said quietly, "in the room downstairs." The room erupted into action. Ada Torres was suddenly very present, moving closer. Officer Mitchell's posture changed. He was no longer simply standing there. He was actively engaged, studying Lily with professional interest. Judge was sitting forward in her chair, her eyes sharp and focused. "Your Honor," said, also leaning forward, "I'd like to request that my client's daughter not be further questioned at this time without—" "The child isn't being formally questioned," Judge interrupted. "She's simply having a conversation. Ms., do you object to your daughter speaking about what she's observed?" Emma's head was spinning. She wanted to protect Lily from this, to shield her from the machinery of the legal system. But she also needed to understand what her daughter knew. "What room downstairs?" she heard herself asking. Lily's face scrunched up in concentration, the way it did when she was trying to remember something difficult. "The room where Daddy keeps things. The room with the smell. The room with—" She paused, searching for words that her limited vocabulary couldn't quite capture. "The white things in boxes." Officer Mitchell and Ada Torres exchanged a look. It was a look of profound significance, the look of investigators who had just stumbled onto corroborating evidence that they didn't expect to find in a family court. "And the dog?" Ada Torres asked carefully, his voice gentle and measured. "Was the dog like this one?" Lily nodded emphatically. "Same kind, but the other dog made me scared." Those 5 words hung in the air like a death knell. Emma felt her entire body go cold. Scared. Her daughter had been scared at its house. Scared of a dog that was apparently kept in some kind of basement room or was storing packages of white substances. The implications crashed down on Emma like a tidal wave. "Scared how?" asked quietly, perhaps sensing that the conversation, while unexpected, was actually providing the most crucial testimony of the entire hearing. "Loud," Lily said, covering her ears with her small hands. "Barking loud. And Daddy was mean to the dog. He yelled at the dog, and I didn't like it there. I want to go to Mommy's." Tears were streaming down Emma's face now. Her daughter had been exposed to all of this. The criminal operation, the aggressive dog, the hostile environment. And Emma had had no idea. She'd been so focused on the custody battle, on proving herself to a judge, that she hadn't even considered what might be happening in the hours Lily spent with her father. Judge looked at Officer Mitchell. "Officer, it appears your investigation may have just acquired significant corroborating evidence. The child has independently described details that could verify the presence of canine activity at the property in question." Officer Mitchell nodded slowly. "Your Honor, this is actually quite significant. We did detect evidence of animal presence during our surveillance, but we weren't sure if it was relevant. The child's account suggests it wasn't just incidental." "We need to document this," Ada Torres said, already pulling out his phone. "We should get a formal statement from the child, not as testimony but as evidence for the investigation." "Agreed," Judge said. She looked at Emma. "Ms., I'm going to order that your daughter be interviewed by a child psychologist present in the courthouse. This interview will be documented and may be used as supporting evidence in the criminal investigation. Do you consent?" Emma looked at Lily, at her small daughter's face, at the fear and confusion in her eyes. She knew she should probably refuse, should probably protect her daughter from further legal entanglement. But she also knew that Lily's account could be crucial, not just to the criminal case against, but to ensuring that what had happened to her daughter was fully understood and addressed. "Yes," Emma whispered. "Yes, I consent." Judge nodded and gestured to a bailiff. "Please escort Ms. and her daughter to the interview room, and alert Dr. Sarah that we have an urgent matter for her attention." As Emma stood to leave with Lily, she caught sight of. His face had transformed into a mask of absolute panic. His attorney was frantically whisper-arguing with him, but wasn't responding. He was staring at Lily with an expression of dawning horror. The realization that his 3-year-old daughter, in her innocence and her need to communicate what she'd witnessed, had just destroyed him completely. The interview room was nothing like the intimidating formal spaces of the courthouse. It had been deliberately designed to feel safe, welcoming, and non-threatening to children. Colorful murals of friendly animals decorated the walls. Soft lighting replaced the harsh fluorescent glare of the courtroom. A low table held an array of toys, building blocks, stuffed animals, drawing supplies, and various dolls and action figures. It was the kind of room that made adults feel slightly out of place, but where children could feel comfortable enough to open up about difficult experiences. Dr. Sarah sat in a small chair, her posture deliberately casual and non-threatening. She was a woman in her late 40s with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who had spent 2 decades interviewing traumatized children. She wore soft colors, a pale blue cardigan over a cream-colored blouse, nothing that would startle or intimidate a young child. Beside her sat a camera on a tripod, pointed toward the low table where Lily would sit. Everything was being documented. Everything would be preserved as evidence. Emma sat slightly apart from her daughter, behind a low partition that allowed her to see and hear everything but wouldn't distract Lily during the interview. A court recorder, a young man in his 20s with a serious expression, sat nearby, capturing every word digitally. Ada Torres stood outside the room, observing through a one-way mirror along with Officer Mitchell. This wasn't an interrogation in the traditional sense. It was a careful, methodical documentation of what a 3-year-old child had witnessed. "Hi, Lily," Doctor said softly, smiling warmly. "My name is Dr. Sarah. Do you want to come sit with me and play for a little bit?" Lily looked uncertain. She glanced back at Emma, who nodded encouragement. Slowly, cautiously, Lily walked over to the low table and climbed into a small chair across from Doctor. She seemed smaller in this space, more vulnerable, but also slightly more relaxed than she'd been in the formal courtroom. "I have a lot of toys here," Doctor continued, gesturing to the array of objects on the table. "Would you like to pick some to play with?" Lily nodded shyly and reached for a stuffed puppy dog. She held it in her lap, her small fingers stroking its soft fur repeatedly. Doctor smiled. "That's a nice dog. Do you like dogs?" Lily's response was complicated. She nodded but then shook her head, her expression becoming conflicted. "I like some dogs," she said carefully, "but not all dogs." "That makes sense," Doctor said gently. "Not all dogs are the same, right? Some are nice and some are not as nice." Lily looked up at Doctor with an expression that seemed far too serious for a 3-year-old. "Some dogs are mean," she said quietly. "Have you met a mean dog?" Doctor asked, her voice remaining soft and non-leading. Lily nodded. She began to fidget with the stuffed dog's ears, twisting them between her fingers. "At Daddy's house," she said. "Tell me about that," Doctor encouraged. She was doing this expertly, neither pushing too hard nor asking leading questions. Everything was open-ended, designed to allow Lily to share her own memories and observations. "The dog was in the room downstairs," Lily began, her words coming slowly as she worked through the memory. "The room under the house. Daddy took me down there sometimes." Emma's hands clenched into fists. She'd never known that had taken Lily to a basement. She thought his visits were to his apartment, to the living room, to places where a child might reasonably spend time. The image of her small daughter descending into some hidden basement made her feel physically ill. "What was in that room?" Doctor asked gently. Lily was quiet for a moment, organizing her thoughts. She looked around the interview room as if searching for the right words. "Lots of things," she finally said. "There were machines and bottles and boxes with white things. The boxes were stacked up really high." Doctor reached over and gently turned a blank piece of paper toward Lily, along with some crayons. "Do you want to draw what you remember? That might help you explain it better." Lily picked up a brown crayon and began to draw. Her artwork was the typical scribble of a young child, not representational, not clearly defined, but her narration gave it meaning. "This is the table," Lily said, drawing a long rectangular shape. "And this is where the bottles were." She made a cluster of circular scribbles. "And this is the machine that went beep, beep, beep." She drew a larger rectangle with lines coming out of it. "That sounds complicated," Doctor observed. "Did the machine scare you?" "The noise scared me sometimes," Lily admitted. "But the dog scared me more. The dog barked a lot, really loud, and Daddy got mad at the dog." "What did Daddy do when he got mad at the dog?" Doctor asked carefully. Lily's expression became troubled. "He yelled. He hit the dog sometimes. I didn't like it. I wanted to leave." Emma had to bite down on her fist to keep from making a sound. Not only had been operating a drug lab, but he'd been abusing an animal in front of their daughter. The layers of dysfunction and danger were accumulating exponentially. "Did you ever tell your daddy you were scared?" Doctor continued. Lily nodded. "I told him I didn't like the dog and I didn't like that room. I told him it smelled bad, and he said—" Lily paused, searching for the exact words. "He said it was a secret and I couldn't tell Mommy." The court recorder's pen stopped for a moment before resuming its steady documentation. Ada Torres' expression, visible through the observation window, had hardened into something cold and prosecutorial. "So Daddy said it was a secret," Doctor repeated gently. "Did he say why it was a secret?" "He said Mommy wouldn't understand," Lily explained with the straightforward logic of a young child. "He said she would be mad. He said I had to be quiet about it." "Did the dog do anything besides bark and get yelled at?" Doctor asked. Lily thought about this seriously. Sometimes people came to the house, and the dog would go crazy. He would jump and try to bite the people. Daddy had to hold him a lot. The dog wanted to bite everything. "How many people came to the house?" Doctor asked. "I don't know," Lily said, her attention drifting back to her drawing. "Sometimes there were 3 people, sometimes there were more. They would go downstairs and they would be loud, and I could hear them moving boxes." Emma was taking in every word, every detail. She was horrified and heartbroken and angry all at once. Her daughter had been placed in a dangerous environment repeatedly. She'd been exposed to criminal activity, to animal abuse, to the machinery of drug trafficking, and all the while had been manipulating her into silence, using a child's natural obedience to keep her quiet about what she'd witnessed. Doctor continued gently probing Lily's memories for another 45 minutes. The child described the chemical smell that made her throat hurt sometimes. She described the heat of the room, the uncomfortable feeling when she went downstairs. She described how long the visits lasted, sometimes just a few minutes, sometimes several hours. She described the various people who came, their general appearances, the conversations she overheard. By the end of the interview, a picture had emerged, not a clear, legally admissible testimony, but a detailed account of a 3-year-old's exposure to a fully operational drug manufacturing facility. Every detail Lily provided corroborated what the federal investigation had already uncovered. When Doctor finally wound down the interview, Lily was visibly tired. The emotional labor of retrieving and communicating these memories had exhausted her. She curled against her mother as soon as Emma scooped her up, her small body going limp with fatigue. "Thank you for talking with me, Lily," Doctor said warmly. "You were very brave." Outside the interview room, Ada Torres and Officer Mitchell stood with Judge, who had observed the entire session. The judge's expression was grim and resolved. "That child's account is remarkable," the judge said quietly. "Unwitting corroboration of every major element of your investigation." "It's more than corroboration," Ada Torres said, his voice tight with the satisfaction of a prosecutor closing in on a conviction. "It's proof that this wasn't a passive operation, deliberately exposed a young child to this environment repeatedly. That's not just drug manufacturing. That's child endangerment. That's recklessness of the highest order." Officer Mitchell was already making phone calls, updating the search team with the new information Lily had provided. The details about the dog, the machines, the chemical smell, all of it would help them know exactly what to look for and where to look. Emma held Lily close, feeling her daughter's breathing gradually slow and deepen as exhaustion pulled her toward sleep. Whatever happened next, whatever legal machinery was about to be set in motion, this moment of her daughter finally being safe in her arms, was everything Emma had been fighting for all along. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the suburban neighborhood as federal agents began positioning themselves around the property at 2847 Drive. To the casual observer, it looked like any other middle-class home, a two-story house with a manicured lawn, a detached garage, and a driveway lined with neatly trimmed hedges. Nothing about its exterior suggested the criminal enterprise operating within its walls. Nothing revealed the danger that lurked behind closed doors. Officer James Mitchell stood with the search team, coordinating with Ada Torres and the federal agents who had been investigating for over a year. The emergency warrant, now signed by Judge herself, was authorized based not only on the months of surveillance and financial documentation, but also on the corroborating testimony of a 3-year-old child who had innocently described a basement laboratory, hazardous chemicals, an abused animal, and packages of white substances. "Everyone clear on the protocol?" Officer Mitchell asked, addressing the team of 6 agents and 2 additional K-9 units. "We go in fast, we secure the property, and we document everything before we touch anything. These K-9s will alert on narcotics and precursor chemicals. Take their alerts seriously. If we're dealing with active manufacturing equipment, there could be volatile compounds." The agents nodded, their expressions grave and focused. Drug labs were inherently dangerous. The chemicals used in manufacturing methamphetamine were toxic, flammable, and potentially explosive. A careless move could result in injuries or worse. But they'd all received the briefing about Lily's description of the basement, and they knew they were likely to find exactly what she described. At 3:47 p.m., Officer Mitchell gave the signal. The agents approached the front door with tactical precision. One of them held a battering ram. The door was heavy but not reinforced. It gave way on the second strike, splintering inward with a crash that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Neighbors who had been tending their gardens or washing cars suddenly stopped what they were doing, watching with shocked expressions as federal agents flooded into the house in tactical gear. "Federal agents, search warrant," the lead agent shouted, his voice authoritative and commanding. "Everyone on the ground now." The house appeared empty, was still in custody at the courthouse, and there were no other occupants. The agents moved through the first floor methodically, clearing rooms, establishing that the property was secure. Then they descended the basement stairs, and Officer Mitchell released the first K-9, a Belgian named Duke who had been trained to detect narcotics. Duke's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The dog's entire body went rigid, his nose working overtime as he processed the overwhelming chemical signatures filling the basement air. He began to alert frantically, packing back and forth, whining with the intensity of detecting a massive concentration of controlled substances. "We've got a hot zone," one of the agents called out, his equipment detecting elevated chemical readings on his detection device. "This is active manufacturing setup. Move carefully. There could be volatile compounds." What they discovered was precisely what Lily had described: a fully operational methamphetamine manufacturing laboratory. The basement had been retrofitted with industrial-grade equipment. Beakers and flasks lined metal shelving units. Clear tubing connected various containers. Heating elements and ventilation systems had been installed. The smell, that distinctive, acrid chemical odor that Lily had found so disturbing, was overwhelming even to the seasoned agents who had encountered numerous drug labs. "Document everything," Ada Torres instructed, already photographing the scene with a digital camera. "Take measurements. Get samples of everything for lab analysis." The agents moved through the space with practiced efficiency, photographing every detail. They collected samples of liquids, powders, and crystalline substances. They documented the equipment, the supplies, the organizational structure of the operation. But what they found next was particularly damning: boxes upon boxes of packaged products. Small baggies containing crystalline methamphetamine, carefully wrapped and sealed for distribution. "Estimate?" one agent asked, gesturing to the stack of boxes. "At least $50,000 worth," another agent replied, doing a rapid calculation based on volume and typical street values. "Possibly more." Officer Mitchell's second K9, a German shepherd named Rex, was brought into the basement. Like Duke before him, Rex's reaction was immediate and extreme. The dog alerted on the boxes, on the equipment, on the shelving units themselves. The chemical residue had thoroughly contaminated every surface. This wasn't a small-scale operation. This was industrial-level drug manufacturing. "Look at this," one of the agents called out, pointing to a corner of the basement. A large cage had been set up, complete with water and food bowls. Animal waste covered the floor. Claw marks the metal bars. Dried blood stained one corner. It was clearly where had kept the dog, the same dog that Lily had been terrified of, the same animal that had barked aggressively at visitors, that had been beaten when it became too vocal. Officer Mitchell's jaw clenched. This wasn't just a drug operation. It was a monument to human cruelty and criminal negligence. A dog had been kept in these conditions, abused when it didn't comply, and a small child had been brought into this environment repeatedly. But the most incriminating discovery came when the agents accessed security system. They found a DVR connected to multiple cameras that had been recording continuously. Officer Mitchell and Ada Torres reviewed the footage, and what they witnessed was horrifying in its clarity. Multiple visitors arriving and departing at odd hours, individuals carrying equipment into the basement, instructing people on procedures, handling packages and organizing inventory, and then, most damning of all, bringing a small child into the basement. Lily, unmistakably Lily in the pink dress she often wore, descending the basement stairs while holding his hand. The footage showed Lily covering her ears as the dog barked, yelling at the dog, then striking it with his open hand. Lily looking confused and frightened, leading her back upstairs and then returning to inventory work as if he hadn't just exposed his daughter to both animal abuse and a major drug manufacturing operation. "That's it," Ada Torres said quietly, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "That's everything we need. That child's account is now corroborated by physical evidence, chemical analysis, surveillance footage, and the K9 alerts. Doesn't have a prayer in criminal court." The evidence collection continued for another 3 hours. Agents carefully packaged every substance, took photographs of every detail, documented the precise measurements and positioning of equipment. They collected the animal waste from the dog cage as evidence of animal cruelty. They extracted the hard drives from the security system. They collected financial documents hidden in filing cabinets, records of transactions, supplier contacts, distribution routes. By 8:15 p.m., The evidence team had collected enough material to fill 2 large evidence vans. Laboratory analysis would take weeks, but the preliminary field tests had already confirmed the presence of methamphetamine precursor chemicals and finished product methamphetamine. The dog had been removed from the property by animal control officers, severely malnourished and bearing signs of chronic abuse. It would require extensive veterinary care, but the animal was expected to survive. Officer Mitchell stood in the basement as the last of the evidence was being packed away. He looked around at the space where a small child had been brought to witness criminal activity. He thought of Lily's innocent face, her attempt to communicate what she'd seen, her words that had single-handedly blown this investigation wide open. "The prosecutor's going to have a field day with this," one of the agents commented, standing beside Officer Mitchell. "As he should," Officer Mitchell replied. "This wasn't just drug trafficking. This was exploitation of a child. This was animal abuse. This was systematic, organized criminal enterprise. Built this, and now he's going to pay for it." When was brought in for questioning later that evening, he was confronted with the evidence, confronted with the photographs, the chemical analysis, the security footage. His expensive attorney advised immediate cooperation and a guilty plea. There was no defense. There was no explanation that could possibly mitigate what the evidence revealed. Would face federal charges for drug manufacturing, drug trafficking, money laundering, and child endangerment. The security footage of him striking the dog would result in animal cruelty charges at the state level. Every illegal transaction he'd engaged in was now documented and traceable. And it had all begun because a 3-year-old girl had pointed at a police dog and said 2 words, "Daddy's dog." The federal courthouse was a different beast than the family law division where the custody hearing had taken place just hours earlier. This courtroom was larger, more austere, designed for serious criminal proceedings. The gallery was filled with federal prosecutors, DEA agents, local law enforcement officials, and journalists who had picked up on the story. What had begun as a routine custody hearing had transformed into a major drug trafficking case with the added element of child endangerment, a narrative that captured media attention. Sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, his expensive attorney beside him looking increasingly grim with each passing moment. His name had been circulated through the federal database, and the charges against him kept multiplying as investigators uncovered new layers to his criminal enterprise. Federal Judge Robert Harrison, a stern man in his 60s with a reputation for harsh sentencing in drug cases, reviewed the complaint. The list of charges was extensive: manufacturing methamphetamine, distribution of methamphetamine, money laundering, conspiracy, drug trafficking across state lines, animal cruelty, and most significantly, child endangerment. The last charge carried particular weight because it involved exposing a minor to a dangerous criminal environment. "Mr. Judge Harrison said, his voice resonating through the courtroom, "You are charged with 10 federal counts. How do you plead?" Attorney stood. "Your Honor, my client would like to enter into plea negotiations. Given the evidence, we believe the most prudent course of action is—" "I understand," Judge Harrison interrupted. "Ada Torres, what is the prosecution's position?" Ada Torres stood, looking remarkably composed considering he'd been working on this case for over 14 months. "Your Honor, the government has significant evidence in this matter. We have financial documentation spanning 14 months, surveillance records covering a 3-month period, physical evidence recovered from the defendant's property, expert analysis of controlled substances, and testimony from a credible witness regarding the defendant's operation." "The witness being?" Judge Harrison asked, reviewing his notes. "A 3-year-old child who was taken to the manufacturing facility on multiple occasions," Ada Torres explained. "The child's account, obtained through proper channels with a child psychologist, corroborates every major element of the investigation. The child described the basement laboratory, the equipment, the packaged products, and the presence of an animal kept in the facility. Attorney immediately objected. Your Honor, the prosecution is attempting to use the statement of a 3-year-old, a child who cannot possibly provide reliable testimony, as evidence of criminal activity. This is clearly prejudicial and the child's statement wasn't offered as testimony, Ada Torres countered firmly. It was offered as investigative lead material that resulted in the discovery of verifiable physical evidence. The chemical analysis, the security footage, the financial records, all of that is independent corroboration. The child simply pointed us in the right direction. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Counsel, I've reviewed the evidence package. The security footage alone is sufficient to establish probable cause and guilt beyond reasonable doubt for at least 5 of the 10 counts. The child's statement, while certainly compelling, is actually peripheral to the overwhelming physical evidence recovered from the property. Attorney seemed to deflate slightly. He leaned over and whispered urgently to his client. After a moment, nodded reluctantly. Your Honor, the defense attorney said, given the overwhelming nature of the evidence, my client wishes to enter a guilty plea to 7 of the 10 counts in exchange for the dismissal of the remaining charges and a recommendation for a substantial but not excessive sentence. Ada Torres considered this briefly before responding. The government would accept a guilty plea to 8 counts. We're not dropping the animal cruelty charges or the child endangerment charge. Those are non-negotiable. Judge Harrison nodded approvingly. That seems reasonable. Mister, do you understand what you're doing? Stood slowly, looking diminished in the orange jumpsuit. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Yes, Your Honor, I understand. I want to plead guilty. To which counts? Judge Harrison asked. All of them, said his attorney's face going pale. I want to plead guilty to all 10 counts. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. This was an unusual move. By pleading guilty to all counts rather than the negotiated 8, was essentially guaranteeing himself a more severe sentence. His attorney was frantically gesticulating, trying to get his client to reconsider, but wasn't looking at him. He was staring straight ahead, his expression defeated and hollow. Mister, Judge Harrison said carefully, I need to ensure you understand what you're doing. By pleading guilty to all 10 counts, you're waiving your right to trial, to confront witnesses, to present a defense. You're also likely looking at a significantly longer sentence than the negotiated plea would have resulted in. I understand, said quietly. I did it, all of it. I deserve the punishment. What happened next was a sentencing hearing that would span 2 days. Prosecutors presented evidence, walked through the timeline of the operation, described the quantities of drugs involved, detailed the financial transactions. They presented the security footage showing instructing people on manufacturing procedures, showing him packing products for distribution, showing him striking the dog. Then came the most difficult testimony, a video recording of Lily's interview with Dr. The courtroom was silent as the 3-year-old's voice filled the space, describing what she'd seen and experienced in the basement. Journalists took notes frantically. Some observers in the gallery wiped away tears. Judge Harrison's expression remained stoic, but something in his eyes hardened. Attorney presented the defense case, which consisted primarily of character witnesses and arguments for leniency. People that came from a difficult background, that he'd made poor choices, that he regretted his actions. But every argument fell flat against the mountain of evidence showing premeditated, systematic drug manufacturing. During the final arguments, Ada Torres stood and addressed Judge Harrison directly. Your Honor, this case involves not just drug trafficking, but the exploitation of a young child. The defendant deliberately exposed his 3-year-old daughter to a dangerous criminal environment on multiple occasions. He kept her quiet through manipulation and lies. He struck an animal in front of her. He created an environment of fear and danger. This isn't a case where we can simply punish the drug crime and overlook the child endangerment. They're inextricably linked. Saturni attempted a rebuttal, arguing that the child endangerment charges were redundant with the drug charges, that his client had suffered enough already, that a sentence in the range of 8 to 10 years would be appropriate. Judge Harrison was unmoved. He sentenced to 12 years in federal prison on the drug charges, with an additional 5 years for the animal cruelty charges, the sentences to run consecutively rather than concurrently. 17 years total, would be nearly 50 years old before he had any possibility of release. But the criminal consequences were only part of the fallout. 3 weeks after the sentencing, Judge reconvened the custody hearing. She reviewed the evidence from the criminal case, the security footage, the testimony regarding conditions in the home, the documentation of how had deliberately exposed Lily to criminal activity and animal abuse. Based on the evidence presented in the criminal proceedings, Judge stated, her voice carrying the weight of judicial finality, I am formally terminating the parental rights of. The court finds that Mr. demonstrated a fundamental failure to protect his minor child from danger. He deliberately exposed her to hazardous chemicals, criminal activity, animal abuse, and psychological trauma. His actions demonstrated a callous disregard for the child's safety. She looked directly at Emma. Ms., you are granted full sole custody of Lily, with no visitation rights for the biological father. Mr. is prohibited from having any contact with the child without prior written permission from the court. This is a permanent determination. Standing beside his attorney in shackles, closed his eyes. He looked like a man who had finally, completely, run out of options. Outside the courtroom, Emma held Lily in her arms. The custody battle was over. The criminal case was resolved. Her daughter was safe, legally protected, and would never again have to worry about being taken to a house of horrors by a man who had chosen profit over paternal responsibility. Lily asked innocently, Mommy, where's Daddy? Emma took a deep breath. Daddy made some very bad choices, sweetheart. He's going to go away for a very long time, but you're safe now. You're always going to be safe. It wasn't the answer a 3-year-old could fully comprehend, but it was the truth. And for Emma, that was finally enough. 6 months had passed since Judge's final ruling. Emma stood in the doorway of her new apartment, watching the afternoon sunlight paint golden patterns across the hardwood floors. The space was modest but filled with warmth, walls painted in soft sage green, overflowing with children's books, and a corner dedicated entirely to Lily's artwork. Every crayon drawing, every finger painting, every construction paper creation was proudly displayed, a testament to the life they were rebuilding together. The apartment was in a different neighborhood, several miles away from the courthouse, the police precinct, and every place that held difficult memories. Emma had deliberately chosen this location because it felt like a fresh start. The building was surrounded by a small community of families, with a playground nearby where children laughed and played without fear. It was the kind of environment where Emma could finally breathe, where she could release some of the tension that had become her constant companion over the past year and a half. She had also been promoted. The hospital had recognized her dedication and offered her the position of head nurse in the pediatric ward. It was a role that acknowledged her skills while providing more stable hours and the flexibility she needed to prioritize Lily's recovery. The promotion came with a salary increase that allowed her to move out of the cramped studio apartment where she and Lily had lived during the custody battle. It allowed her to provide her daughter with a bedroom of her own, with walls decorated with soft pastel colors and a canopy bed that made Lily feel like she was sleeping in a castle. But the physical improvements to their living situation were just the surface. The real healing had been much deeper and more complex. Lily had begun working with a trauma-informed therapist, a gentle woman named Doctor who specialized in helping young children process difficult experiences. The sessions were play-based, allowing Lily to work through her memories and emotions using toys, art, and storytelling. Emma had initially worried that therapy would somehow damage her daughter further, but she'd witnessed the opposite. With each session, Lily seemed to shed another layer of fear and confusion. The nightmares had decreased significantly. In the first few months after the proceedings, Lily would wake up screaming, her small body drenched in sweat, her voice crying out about scary rooms and loud dogs. Emma would hold her daughter through the night, whispering reassurances, singing lullabies, doing whatever it took to convince Lily that she was safe. But gradually, the nightmares became less frequent. Now, 3 nights out of every 7, Lily slept through the entire night without incident. Emma had also sought her own therapy, something she probably should have done years earlier. A therapist named Dr. Reeves had helped her process the guilt, the anger, and the lingering trauma of the custody battle. "You didn't know what was happening," Dr. Reeves had told her during one session. "And even more importantly, you fought for your daughter when it mattered. You protected her. That's what matters." Those words had become Emma's mantra. She repeated them to herself whenever doubt crept in, whenever she wondered if she could have done something differently, if there had been signs she'd missed. The truth had been deliberate in his deception. He'd compartmentalized his life, keeping his criminal enterprise separate from his occasional visits with Lily. But he'd made the fatal mistake of underestimating his daughter's memory and her capacity to communicate what she'd witnessed. Today was a special day, Lily's 4th birthday. Emma had planned a small celebration with just a few of Lily's closest friends from preschool. Balloons hung from the ceiling in various colors. A homemade cake sat on the kitchen counter, decorated with frosting flowers that Emma had painstakingly created. Lily's presents were wrapped and arranged on the living room table: books, art supplies, building blocks, and a special stuffed animal that was supposed to be a comfort object for when she felt anxious. But the most significant gift hadn't been purchased from any store. Earlier that morning, Officer James Mitchell had called Emma's apartment. "I have something I think Lily might like," he'd said, "if you're open to it." He'd arrived at the apartment 2 hours later with his own German Shepherd, not the K9 that had been used in the courtroom, but a different dog named Ranger. Ranger was smaller, gentler, trained as an emotional support animal rather than a detection dog. Officer Mitchell had spent time working with Ranger specifically to help children who had experienced trauma involving animals. "I thought maybe Lily could meet a dog in a positive context," Officer Mitchell had explained. "Not to force anything, but to show her that not all dogs are scary, that some dogs can be helpers and friends." Emma had been hesitant, worried that it might trigger negative memories. But Lily's response had been surprising. She'd watched cautiously as Officer Mitchell brought Ranger into the apartment on a loose leash. The dog was calm, non-threatening, his eyes kind and his posture relaxed. Slowly, carefully, Lily had approached. She'd held out her hand for the dog to sniff, and Ranger had responded with gentle curiosity, his tail wagging slightly. "That dog is nice," Lily had observed after a few minutes of interaction. "Yes, he is," Officer Mitchell had confirmed. "His name is Ranger and he helps people who have been through scary things. He's a helper dog." By the end of the visit, Lily had been petting Ranger and even laughing when the dog licked her hand. The transformation in her expression had been remarkable. Emma had felt tears streaming down her face, not tears of sadness but tears of profound relief. Lily was healing. The trauma wasn't erased, but it was being transformed into something manageable, something that could coexist with joy and hope. Now, as Emma arranged the final decorations for the birthday party, she reflected on how much had changed in half a year. The criminal case had become something of a national story, a small human interest piece about a 3-year-old child whose innocent observation had uncovered a major drug trafficking operation. News outlets had run features on the case, and Emma had received interview requests, which she'd politely declined. Their story belonged to her and Lily, and she wasn't interested in making it entertainment for the masses. The criminal justice system had also taken notice. Lily's case had been cited in several academic papers about interviewing young children in criminal investigations. Doctor had published a paper about play-based interview techniques that had been well received in her professional circles. The case had become a teaching tool, demonstrating how children could provide valuable information without being directly questioned as witnesses. But for Emma and Lily, what mattered most was simply the fact that they were safe, was in federal prison serving his 17-year sentence. The custody battle was over. Lily was in a stable, loving home. Emma had a career that she found meaningful and fulfilling. Their lives had structure and predictability and the possibility of a future by fear. The doorbell rang at precisely 2:00 p.m., signaling the arrival of Lily's friends and their parents. Emma watched as her daughter greeted each guest with hugs and excited chatter. Lily had always been a social child, but now there was a quality to her sociability that spoke of genuine confidence and trust. The shadows that had haunted her eyes during the custody hearing had gradually faded, replaced by the brightness of a child who was finally, truly safe. As the children played and ate cake, Emma stepped onto the apartment balcony, needing a moment of quiet reflection. She looked out over the neighborhood, the playground, the trees, the families going about their everyday lives. She thought about the journey that had brought her here to this moment on this ordinary afternoon. She thought about the courthouse, the judge's expression of shock, the moment when Lily had pointed at the K9 and said, "Daddy's dog." She thought about how a 3-year-old's innocent observation had set in motion a chain of events that had resulted in justice, in protection, in the exposure of criminal enterprise. She thought about resilience, Lily's remarkable ability to process trauma and continue forward with hope and curiosity. She thought about her own strength, her unwavering determination to protect her daughter, her refusal to accept a system that might have failed them. Emma heard Lily laughing inside the apartment, a sound so pure and genuine that it felt like medicine for every wound inflicted over the past 18 months. She whispered a quiet thank you to the universe, to whatever force had guided her through this impossible situation. And then she turned back toward the apartment, toward her daughter, toward the life they were building together one day at a time. Lily ran to her the moment she stepped inside. "Mommy, we're playing a game, come play with us." Emma knelt down and pulled her daughter into her arms, breathing in the scent of birthday cake and childhood innocence. "Of course, baby, I'm coming." As she stood with Lily's hand in hers, watching the children play, Emma felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time. Not hope, which she'd clung to as a survival mechanism, but genuine happiness. The kind of uncomplicated joy that comes from knowing that your child is safe, that the worst is behind you, and that the future stretches ahead with infinite possibility. The custody battle was over, the criminal case was closed, and life finally was beginning again. The end.